Agent Maya Daniels was no stranger to blending in. But tonight, every gaze in the lavish restaurant felt like a spotlight. Being an undercover FBI agent meant dealing with pressure. But this time, it wasn't the criminals she was worried about. It was the uniformed officer striding straight toward her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're tuning in from. Let's dive in. Maya subtly adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist. To most, it was a sleek, understated accessory, but hidden beneath its surface was a top-tier recording device. Her gaze drifted across the restaurant, sharp and observant despite her composed exterior. Years of training had taught her to blend seamlessly into any environment, yet tonight, her senses buzzed with heightened awareness. This wasn't just any upscale venue, it was a hotspot for the city's elite. More importantly, it was a central piece in an ongoing investigation into a sophisticated international money laundering network. Maya's assignment was critical, and Hector Morales was at the heart of it all. A charismatic businessman with connections to criminal enterprises, Morales funneled illegal funds through establishments just like this one. Maya's job? Gather irrefutable evidence. No mistakes, no exposure. Tonight was supposed to be routine surveillance, but the air felt different. Something was off. The dining room bustled with elegantly dressed patrons, their conversations murmuring softly in the background. On the surface, no one paid her much attention. Yet Maya couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The subtle but familiar weight of standing out pressed on her, the only black woman in a sea of privilege. She shifted in her chair, fingers grazing the menu in front of her, pretending to study it. A waiter approached, offering her the wine list with a polite but distant nod. His professionalism didn't mask the subtle awkwardness in his demeanor. Maya had seen it before. The fleeting glances, the slight hesitation, a silent question lingering in the air. Why is she here? But she wasn't here to concern herself with their discomfort. She had a job to do. The faint buzz of her earpiece, hidden beneath her dark, cascading hair, snapped her focus back to the mission. Maya, stay sharp. Morales just arrived. He's at the bar, came the voice of her, Agent Patrick Reed. Maya's eyes flicked to the bar. Morales had just entered, all smiles and handshakes as he greeted his associates. His carefree demeanor masked the dangerous web he spun behind the scenes. A familiar rush of adrenaline coursed through her. This case had been months in the making, and tonight could be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. But then, the shift. Conversations dimmed. The energy in the room tightened. Maya sensed it before she saw it. Patrons' gazes quietly aligned toward the entrance. A uniformed police officer stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding authority, he scanned the room with the deliberate gaze of someone on a mission. Officer Ben Callahan. Maya recognized him immediately. His reputation preceded him, a cop who believed in asserting dominance wherever he went. Brash, self-assured, and unwavering in his belief that his authority was absolute. Maya lowered her head slightly, eyes back on the menu, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but the knot forming in her stomach told her otherwise. His gaze had already locked onto her. She felt his deliberate approach. Each step measured. "Ma'am," he greeted, his voice firm, stopping at her table. Maya lifted her eyes, meeting his stare with practiced neutrality. "Yes, officer." Callahan's gaze swept over her, lingering as if he were trying to place her. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Her pulse quickened, but she maintained a calm facade. "I'm just having dinner." Callahan didn't look convinced. His eyes flicked over the empty table, noting the absence of any food or drink. His scrutiny expanded to the rest of the room, as if signaling that she was out of place. "I'm going to need to see some ID." This wasn't part of the plan. Maya's cover as a casual diner was designed to keep her discreet. Callahan's presence threatened everything. She couldn't blow her cover, but showing her FBI credentials wasn't an option either. Maya's expression softened slightly as she kept her tone even. "I'm sorry, officer. Is there a reason you're asking for my ID?" His eyes narrowed. "We've had a few concerns. You seem out of place." Maya's jaw tensed. She recognized this for what it was. It wasn't the first time she'd been profiled, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The fact that she was a black woman alone in an upscale restaurant was enough to raise eyebrows for some. But right now, She couldn't let personal frustration cloud the mission. Any misstep could unravel months of careful preparation. Keeping her movements smooth and deliberate, Maya reached into her bag, retrieving her ID without a word. She handed it over, eyes calm but watchful. Officer Callahan examined the ID, his gaze flicking between the name and photo. "Maya Daniels," he muttered. His eyes narrowed slightly as they met hers again. "You don't strike me as the type to be dining here alone. What's really going on?" Maya's heart thudded as she caught Victor Morales' subtle glance from across the bar. He was watching. Not now. She couldn't afford this. Callahan's attention was the last thing she needed. "Officer," she said softly, keeping her voice even. "I'm just here for dinner. I'm not causing trouble. If there's nothing else, I'd appreciate being left to finish my meal." But Callahan wasn't moving. His weight shifted forward slightly, shoulders squaring. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Further questioning. Maya's pulse quickened, but her exterior remained unshaken. She couldn't afford to let this escalate. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Callahan's face as he raised a hand, signaling to another officer lingering by the door. The smirk he wore told Maya everything. This wasn't about protocol. This was about power. The backup officer, Officer Riley, approached briskly. Callahan reached for Maya's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Maya's mind raced. If she resisted, Morales would see. The entire operation could unravel. For now, she had no choice but to go along. "Let's not make a scene," Callahan said, though his handcuffs were already out. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Maya exhaled silently, biting back the frustration boiling beneath the surface. The murmurs followed her as she was led toward the entrance. The weight of the patron's stares burned like a spotlight on her back. Humiliation gnawed at her, but it paled in comparison to the fear of what this could mean for the mission. Outside, the sharp night air nipped at her skin. She kept her gaze ahead, already calculating her next move. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The slam of the squad car door echoed against the quiet street as Maya was pushed inside. The handcuffs dug into her wrists, biting with every slight movement. She leaned back, staring blankly at the partition in front of her. Moments earlier, she'd been inches away from crucial intel. Now, she was crammed in the back seat of a police cruiser, treated like a suspect instead of an agent in the middle of an undercover operation. Her breath was steady, but beneath the surface, anger simmered. This wasn't just a mistake. It was profiling, plain and simple. Callahan had barely stepped inside the restaurant before zeroing in on her. No questions, no curiosity, just assumptions. Assumptions rooted in the belief that someone like her didn't belong. From the driver's seat, Callahan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. "Got a lot of nerve, don't you?" he said, his voice edged with condescension. "Sitting there like you owned the place. What were you really doing at that restaurant?" Maya held his gaze through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "I told you, I was having dinner. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal." Callahan scoffed, shaking his head as if the very notion was absurd. "Dinner? At a place like that?" His lips curled into a smirk. "Sure. Whatever you say." Maya forced herself to remain calm, but the undertone in his voice wasn't lost on her. She'd heard it before. Disbelief that a black woman could occupy a space reserved for the wealthy without arousing suspicion. But this wasn't just prejudice. This was obstruction. And it was personal. Beside Callahan, Officer Riley remained silent, his hands resting on his lap. His gaze flickered briefly to Maya, but quickly returned to the dashboard. Complicit. Maya's focus sharpened. She didn't have time to dwell on injustice. She had to think ahead. Her earpiece remained discreet beneath her hair, muted for now, but she knew Reed had likely seen the arrest through their surveillance feed. The team would be working on a plan to get her out. Still, Maya wasn't one to wait for rescue. "What's the charge, officer?" she asked calmly. Callahan glanced at her again. "Disturbing the peace." She arched a brow. "Sitting quietly with a menu disturbs the peace now?" His eyes narrowed. "Like I said, you don't belong there. Something's not adding up." Maya's jaw tightened. She stayed silent, letting his words hang in the air. Let him play his hand. She had no intention of folding. Callahan's grip tightened as he dragged Maya from the squad car, his hands still wrapped firmly around her arm. His personal bias clouded his judgment, and every rough tug of the cuffs was laced with unspoken prejudice. Maya could feel it in the way he moved, in the unnecessary force he used to handle her. The station loomed ahead, bright lights spilling onto the cracked pavement, casting long shadows beneath their feet. Callahan yanked the car door open and pulled her out. The cuffs bit deeper into her wrists, but Maya gritted her teeth, refusing to show even a flicker of discomfort. "Let's move," he muttered. His grip was unnecessarily tight, as if he needed to establish dominance one last time. Inside the station, the mood shifted. Conversations lulled. Officers glanced up, their brows creasing at the sight of Maya, handcuffed and well-dressed, yet visibly calm. Confusion clouded their expressions. Some recognized her, though whether from past cases or sheer disbelief at the sight of her in cuffs, she wasn't sure. Officer Riley followed closely behind, his eyes downcast, mouth pressed in a thin line. His silence had weighed heavily throughout the drive. Maya cataloged every detail. Callahan might have been blinded by ego, but Riley's unease hinted at something else: hesitation. Weakness. It was something she might be able to use later. Callahan didn't slow. His focus was razor-sharp as he guided her past the other officers without a word. Maya could feel his satisfaction radiating off him like heat. His chest puffed with the pride of someone who believed he'd just made the arrest of the year. At the holding area, Callahan stopped abruptly, unlocking the cuffs with a hard clink before shoving Maya inside the cold, dimly lit cell. The door clanged shut behind her. "Stay put," his voice smug. "Someone will be down to talk to you shortly." Maya didn't respond. She simply held his gaze as she lowered herself onto the metal bench against the wall, her expression unreadable. Callahan lingered, staring at her as if waiting for some sign of fear or frustration. Maya refused to give him that satisfaction. Eventually, he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps fading down the hall. Maya exhaled slowly, the cold steel bench pressing against her back. Her pulse still thrummed with adrenaline. She glanced at the red marks circling her wrists and felt the familiar burn of anger. But anger wouldn't help her now. The mission wasn't over. Her earpiece buzzed faintly beneath her hair. "Maya, we've got a problem." It was Reed. "No kidding," Maya muttered under her breath, careful to keep her voice low. Surveillance cameras hung in the corners of the cell, their red lights blinking intermittently. "Callahan's out of line. We're working on getting you out, but we can't afford to pull you without risking the case." Maya's eyes flicked to the door. "I know, I'm keeping it together, but Morales saw the whole thing. If he thinks I'm FBI..." "We've got Morales under watch. He left the restaurant, but we think he suspects something. Just sit tight." "Sitting tight isn't really my style," Maya whispered, crossing her arms. "I'm aware," Reed replied dryly. "Trust me, Maya, this'll be over soon." Maya leaned back, letting her head rest against the cold concrete wall. She hated this part, the waiting. It made her feel powerless, and Maya Daniels was anything but. Outside the cell, she could hear Callahan's footsteps echo faintly as he paced back and forth. Every now and then, she caught glimpses of him through the bars, his hands casually resting on his belt, his smirk unwavering. He was still basking in his supposed victory. Maya's fists clenched on instinct, but she forced herself to relax. Callahan's arrogance was temporary, and karma had a funny way of evening the scales. She'd seen it before. Time crawled. The station's hum quieted as the night stretched on. The occasional ring of phones and distant chatter drifted down the hall, but the isolation of the holding cell muted most of it. Maya stared at the ceiling, letting her thoughts churn through every possible outcome. She had been in tighter situations, but this one felt heavier. Not because of the danger, but because of the injustice. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an abuse of power, fueled by Callahan's inability to see beyond his own bias. He had miscalculated, severely. The faint flicker of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like static in the back of Maya's mind. Her foot tapped lightly against the concrete floor as she replayed the arrest in her head. Callahan had walked into the restaurant with assumptions already built in. He hadn't questioned why she was there, just zeroed in. In his mind, a woman like her didn't belong. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. He had no idea who she was. But he would. Maya shifted on the hard metal bench, trying to find even a hint of comfort in the cold, sterile cell. The ache in her wrists lingered, a dull reminder of Callahan's overzealous handling. But her mind refused to settle. It kept circling back to the mission, back to Victor Morales. He had seen the entire scene unfold, every glance, every interaction. If Morales suspected that she was more than just a curious diner, months of undercover work could unravel, and all because of one cop's bruised ego. The faint crackle of her earpiece broke the silence. "Maya, things are moving fast. Stay calm." Reed's voice came through, distorted but clear. "I'm calm," she whispered, careful not to draw attention. "But this situation is spiraling. Morales is sharp. If he's on to me, we've got it under control." "A team's already smoothing things over at the restaurant," Reed assured, his tone clipped but urgent. "As for Callahan, you'll be out soon. We've made a few calls. This will be handled." Maya nodded slightly, the weight of Reed's words grounding her. Knowing her team was working behind the scenes brought some relief, but frustration still simmered beneath the surface. Sitting behind bars, treated like a criminal, wasn't something Maya could simply shake off. She had dedicated her life to justice. And now, she was on the wrong side of the cell door because of a man who saw her as nothing more than an outsider. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Low murmurs followed, voices hushed and tense. Maya stood, pacing the small cell. Something was shifting. She felt it. A minute later, Callahan reappeared. But this time, his swagger was noticeably dimmed. He tried to mask it, but Maya saw the unease flickering behind his eyes. Walking closely behind him was Captain Raymond Harris, broad-shouldered, tall, and stone-faced. His gaze swept the holding area before settling on Maya, his expression unreadable. "Officer Callahan." Harris's voice was clipped and cold. "Can you explain why this woman is sitting in a holding cell?" Callahan stiffened. His posture straightened, but his confidence faltered. "She was acting suspiciously, sir. I received complaints at the restaurant and thought it best to bring her in for questioning." Harris's brow arched. "Complaints from who?" Callahan hesitated. "A few patrons. I didn't catch names, but you followed protocol, right?" Harris's eyes narrowed. Callahan shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. I had reason to believe she was involved in something illegal. I was just doing my job." Maya watched silently, her arms crossed as Harris turned his gaze toward her. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the intensity behind her calm stare seemed to weigh heavily in the air. Harris's expression darkened as he faced Callahan again. "Let me get this straight. You brought her in. No evidence, no formal complaint, because she didn't fit your image of someone who should be there?" Callahan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "Officer," Harris continued, his tone dropping, "do you have any proof she committed a crime, or are you basing this purely on assumptions?" The room grew quiet. Callahan's face flushed, the walls closing in on his defense. Maya's earpiece crackled faintly again, but before Reed could say anything, a familiar voice cut through the tension. She didn't refuse anything. Maya's heart lifted as Special Agent Patrick Reed stepped into view, his sharp suit perfectly in place, his presence commanding the attention of the room. Callahan's face paled. "Captain Harris," Reed greeted with a brief nod. "I'm Special Agent Reed, FBI. I believe there's been a serious mistake." Harris's gaze flicked between Reed and Callahan, clearly aware the situation was unraveling quickly. "Special Agent, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We weren't aware of—" "Maya Daniels is one of my top agents," Reed interrupted, his voice cold and firm. "She was on assignment tonight, an assignment that could have been compromised because your officer let his biases get the better of him." Callahan stepped forward, sweat glistening on his brow. "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask." Reed's voice sharpened. "You walked into that restaurant, saw a black woman, and assumed she didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Callahan opened his mouth, but the weight of the room crushed any excuse he could muster. Captain Harris's face hardened. "Special Agent Reed, this will be handled immediately. I'll ensure Officer Callahan's actions are fully investigated, and Agent Daniels will be released right away." Reed's nod was curt. "That's the least you can do." The metal door groaned open, the clanging echoing through the corridor as one of the officers unlocked Maya's cell. The cool air met her as she stepped forward, her spine straightening. The cell was behind her, but the bitterness lingered like a shadow. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer and met Callahan's eyes briefly. "I'll see you around, officer." His gaze dropped as she walked past. The mission wasn't over. But Callahan's moment of unchecked power was. Maya stepped out of the cell with measured grace, her posture tall, refusing to give any indication of the humiliation she had endured. Officer Callahan avoided her gaze, the confidence that once filled his eyes now extinguished. His arrogance had dissolved into quiet shame, and Maya could see the weight of realization settling over him like an anchor. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this wasn't just about her personal pride. This was bigger, about an ongoing, systemic issue. Callahan's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern, a dangerous undercurrent of bias and discrimination that officers like him perpetuated, often without consequence. As she stepped past him, Reed caught her eye. He gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable, but calm. "You okay?" he asked in a low voice. Maya straightened her blazer, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I will be," she replied quietly, "but we need to move fast. Morales might already be suspicious after that scene." "We're handling it," Reed assured her. "Let's get you out of here first." As they moved toward the station's exit, Maya glanced over her shoulder. Callahan remained near the holding cells, rooted in place like a statue. His face was pale, and his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. The tables had turned, and he knew it. His confidence had crumbled, leaving behind a man grappling with the repercussions of his actions. The murmurs of officers echoed softly as Maya passed by. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what would happen next. The energy in the station buzzed with gossip, and Maya knew the inevitable was already in motion. Callahan's days as an officer were numbered. Outside, the night air wrapped around her like a cooling balm. Maya inhaled deeply, savoring the freshness of freedom. Reed gave her a brief pat on the shoulder. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. Maya exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. "It didn't feel like it," she admitted, the exhaustion evident in her tone. "You stayed calm. That's what mattered." She nodded, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "Callahan's going to face consequences, right?" Maya asked, glancing toward the station's entrance. Reed's gaze followed hers. "I guarantee it. Internal Affairs will investigate. And after tonight, he's done. Guys like him don't slip through the cracks forever." Maya released a long breath, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. It wasn't complete closure, but it was a start. As they approached the black SUV parked at the curb, Maya felt the weight of the night's events settle more deeply into her bones. She climbed inside, sinking into the seat as the door shut behind her. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the exhaustion. Her wrists still throbbed from the tight handcuffs, the skin tender beneath her sleeves. The engine's hum filled the silence as the vehicle pulled away from the station. Back inside, Callahan paced the dim hallway of the precinct, his movements restless. His face was flushed, not from exertion, but from the burning embarrassment coursing through his veins. He had always prided himself on his instincts, believing they gave him an edge. But tonight, those very instincts had led him down a dangerous road, one that might cost him everything. The realization struck hard. He had arrested an undercover FBI agent, a woman whose credentials outranked him in every conceivable way. At the far end of the corridor, Captain Harris stood in quiet conversation with several officers. Their glances toward Callahan were brief but piercing, each one a silent verdict. The whispers had already begun. The usual buzz of the station had dulled to murmurs, conversations conducted in the shadows. Callahan could feel the shift, the inevitable judgment of his peers settling around him like a storm cloud. "Callahan?" Harris's voice snapped like a whip, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. Callahan stiffened, forcing his legs to move despite the weight dragging them down. He approached Harris, though each step felt like trudging through quicksand. The captain's gaze bore into him, laced with disappointment. "Come with me." Harris didn't wait for a response. He turned sharply, leading the way toward his office. Callahan followed in silence, the rhythmic thud of his footsteps echoing down the hall. Each sound felt heavier than the last. The walk felt endless, but Callahan knew exactly where it was leading. By the time he reached the office, Harris had already settled behind his desk, hands clasped in front of him. Callahan hesitated at the doorway, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "Sir, Harris raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it." The weight of those two words pinned Callahan in place. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harris's tone remained level, but the fire behind his eyes said more than his words ever could. "You didn't just arrest a civilian tonight. You arrested a federal agent, and you didn't bother to ask questions. Do you know how deep this could go?" Callahan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know she was FBI, Captain. You didn't know because you didn't check. You made assumptions, and now you've embarrassed this department." Callahan's jaw tightened, but no words came. Harris leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You've crossed a line, Callahan. This isn't going away quietly." Silence stretched between them. "Internal Affairs will contact you within the week. Until then, you're suspended, effective immediately." The finality in Harris's voice felt like the crack of a gavel. Callahan nodded stiffly, his pride bruised beyond repair. As he turned to leave, the whispers outside grew louder. Officers avoided his gaze, their judgment clear. Karma, it seemed, had already arrived. Inside Captain Harris's office, the weight of the situation hung like a dense fog. Harris gestured to the chair across from him, but Callahan stood frozen, too tense to sit. His mind scrambled, grasping for any explanation, any justification that might soften the blow. But deep down, he knew. There was no defense for what he had done. Harris shut the door with a quiet finality and settled behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he fixed Callahan with a hard stare. The silence stretched, broken only by the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. "Callahan," Harris finally said, his tone laced with frustration. "What in the hell were you thinking?" Callahan's mouth went dry. "I didn't know she was FBI," he stammered. I thought she was suspicious." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious?" His voice dropped, each syllable sharp and deliberate. "Suspicious because she didn't look like someone who should be eating at an upscale restaurant?" Callahan opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The accusation was too direct, too accurate to deny. "Let me make something clear," Harris said, leaning forward, his eyes locked on Callahan. "What you did tonight wasn't a mistake. It was a violation." Callahan shifted uncomfortably, but Harris didn't let up. "You racially profiled an innocent woman. You arrested her without probable cause, and now the entire department is under scrutiny because of you." Callahan's heart sank. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with relentless force. "I thought she was acting suspicious," he muttered weakly. "Suspicious," Harris repeated coldly, "because she was black? Because she didn't fit in?" He let the words hang in the air. "You didn't assess the situation. You assumed." Callahan's fists clenched at his sides, though he kept his head down. "I was doing my job," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. Harris shook his head, disappointment etched deeply into his face. "That's not your job, Callahan. Your job is to serve everyone, to protect the people in this city, not judge them by the color of their skin." Callahan's shoulders slumped. "What you did tonight wasn't protecting anyone. It was prejudice, and now we all pay the price." The words stung deeper than Callahan anticipated. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, wasn't used to being wrong. The realization cut sharper than he expected. "We're launching an internal investigation," Harris continued, his voice unwavering. "Effective immediately, you're suspended. Pending the outcome, your future here is uncertain." The finality in Harris's tone was a blow to the gut. Callahan's mind spun, processing the implications. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for now dangled by a thread, unraveling because of one moment of unchecked bias. He swallowed hard. "You're dismissed," Harris said flatly. "Turn in your badge and weapon before you leave." The words echoed in Callahan's ears as he nodded stiffly, his body moving on autopilot. As Callahan walked the familiar hallway toward the armory, the eyes of his colleagues followed him. Officers who once greeted him with respect now averted their gaze. Some whispered, their quiet conversations trailing behind him like shadows. The whispers weren't just speculation, they were judgment. Callahan handed over his badge and sidearm, each movement mechanical. When he stepped outside, the cold night air wrapped around him, unforgiving and sharp. He stood beneath the pale glow of the street lamp, staring up at the sky, but the stars offered no comfort. The city, once a familiar landscape, now felt foreign. The man who had walked into the station earlier that evening, confident and self-assured, felt like a stranger to the man standing there now. Meanwhile, in the black SUV parked just down the block, Maya sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the station's entrance. The ache in her wrists had dulled, but the imprint of the night's events lingered. Reed drove quietly, hands steady on the wheel as the city lights passed in a blur. After a few moments, he finally spoke. "Callahan will be dealt with, don't worry." Maya exhaled softly. "It's not about him," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "It's about what he represents." Reed glanced at her briefly, his expression softening. "I know. There are so many like him," Maya continued, her gaze distant. This is just one incident, one officer. How many others slip by unnoticed?" Reed's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "We're making progress, little by little." Maya's eyes drifted to the passing cityscape, the faint glow of lights reflecting in the window. She had faced prejudice her entire life, but tonight had been a stark reminder of how deeply it ran, how embedded it was in the very system she fought to protect. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was an agent sworn to uphold the law, yet even she wasn't immune to its failings. "Sometimes," she whispered, "it feels like nothing changes." Reed was quiet for a long moment. "I get it," he said finally. "But the fact that you're still here, that you didn't let this break you, that's change." Maya glanced at him, offering a faint, tired smile. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Maya Daniels stood at the entrance of the FBI field office, her eyes fixed on the soft glow of the lights inside. The night's cold air clung to her skin, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on her chest. Every step forward felt like peeling away the frustration and humiliation that lingered from her arrest. As the glass doors slid open, the familiar hum of the office washed over her. Computers buzzing softly, low voices drifting from across the room. Beside her, Reed walked silently, his calm presence grounding her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Maya appreciated his support. He'd been there through the worst of it tonight, but she knew this battle extended far beyond one night. "Maya," Reed began, his voice low as they walked down the empty hallway, "I know tonight wasn't easy, but I have to ask, are you sure you're ready to continue with the operation? If you need time, we can pull you out." No one would question it. Maya slowed, glancing at Reed. His concern was genuine. She could see it in his eyes, the slight crease in his brow, the careful tone of his voice. But the fire in her chest hadn't died. If anything, it burned clearer, sharper. The anger she had felt earlier had shifted into something more precise: focus. The case against Victor Morales wasn't over. If she walked away now, the months of work, the hours spent undercover, it could all unravel. Worse, leaving would mean giving power to what had happened tonight. It would mean letting Callahan and men like him derail her mission. "I'm ready," Maya said, her voice steady. "We can't let tonight stop us. Morales saw the arrest. He knows something's up. If we don't move carefully, we'll lose him." Reed studied her for a long moment. "You're sure this isn't about proving something to anyone?" Maya managed a small, tired smile. "It's not. This isn't about Callahan. It's about doing my job. I won't let him dictate how this ends." Reed gave a short nod, satisfied with her resolve. "All right, we'll regroup in the morning. We'll debrief and figure out how to proceed without tipping Morales off." Maya dipped her head in appreciation. "Thanks, Reed, for tonight. You did the hard part." He gestured to the elevator. "Go get some rest. You've earned it." As Maya stepped inside, the soft hum of the building faded behind her. When the elevator doors closed, the silence finally crept in. For the first time all night, she let herself breathe. The emotional toll she had pushed aside began to surface. The anger, the humiliation, the sharp sting of the cuffs digging into her skin. Thompson's condescending voice echoed in her mind, along with the judgmental glances from the restaurant's patrons. It wasn't just about tonight. It was about what tonight represented. No matter how qualified, experienced, or successful she was, there would always be people who saw her as less than. The elevator dinged softly as the doors opened to the parking lot. The cool air was refreshing against her skin, grounding her in the present. Maya inhaled deeply and the cold filled her lungs. She was resilient. She always had been. This wouldn't break her. As she reached her car, Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She frowned at the unknown number flashing across the screen. Her instincts told her to ignore it, but something tugged at her curiosity. "Hello?" A pause. Then, "Agent Daniels." The voice was hesitant, almost unsure of itself. Maya's grip tightened around the phone. She knew that voice. "Callahan, I know this is unexpected," he began, his tone missing the arrogance from earlier that evening. "But I needed to talk to you about tonight." Maya's hand instinctively hovered over the end call button. Her exhaustion screamed at her to cut him off. What could he possibly say to undo the damage? But something in his voice, the crack of uncertainty, the absence of smugness, made her pause. "I'm listening." Callahan exhaled sharply, as if relieved she hadn't hung up. "Look," he started, his words slow and deliberate. I messed up. I know that." Maya leaned against her car, crossing her free arm over her chest. "You did more than mess up, Callahan." Her voice remained calm, but the edge of frustration was impossible to miss. "You crossed a line." There was silence on the other end. "I don't expect forgiveness," Callahan finally said. "But I wanted to tell you, I've been on the force for over 10 years, and I thought I understood people. I thought I was doing the right thing." Maya's jaw tightened. "And tonight? You still think that?" "No." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Tonight, I realized I've been wrong for a long time." She closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle. It wasn't an apology. Not fully, but it was something. "Why are you calling me, Callahan?" "Because I needed to say it out loud, and I thought you deserved to hear it." Maya didn't respond right away. "I appreciate the call," she said finally, her voice softening just slightly. "But this isn't about me. If you really mean what you're saying, change. Make sure what happened tonight doesn't happen to someone else." "I will." Maya hung up, sliding her phone into her pocket. She didn't know if Callahan's words meant anything. Maybe they would fade by morning. But maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Maya's focus shifted forward. There was still work to do. Maya's hand hovered over the end call button, but something held her back. Curiosity, maybe, or that part of her that still believed in accountability. Even when the apology came too late, even when the damage was already done, she found herself listening. "Go ahead," she said, her tone flat. A long pause filled the line. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Callahan finally admitted, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't realize how wrong until tonight. When I arrested you." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wasn't thinking. I acted on assumptions, and that's on me." Maya leaned against the car, staring out at the flickering city lights. His words drifted into the night, but she kept her breath steady, her mind working through the tangled emotions bubbling beneath the surface. It didn't matter. Whether Callahan had suddenly found clarity, or whether he was drowning in guilt, it didn't undo what happened. His self-reflection, while important to him, didn't erase the handcuffs on her wrists or the humiliation of being paraded through a precinct like a criminal. "I've been suspended," Callahan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's an investigation, but I wanted to tell you myself. I'm sorry." Maya's fingers tightened around the phone. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of his words. "I know that doesn't fix what happened," he added, "but I'm trying to understand what I did. And why." Maya exhaled slowly, letting the tension slip through her fingers like grains of sand. She didn't owe him anything, not understanding, not comfort, but she believed in people owning their mistakes. "Officer Callahan," she began, keeping her voice calm but unwavering, "what happened tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a much bigger issue, one people like me face every day." The line was silent, save for Callahan's faint breathing. "I appreciate that you realize what you did was wrong," she continued, "but it doesn't change the fact that you abused your authority. You acted on prejudice." Maya could almost hear the gears turning in his head. The silence stretched, heavier than before. "I know," Callahan said finally, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I'm going to do better. I'll face whatever comes from this." Maya nodded to herself, though Callahan couldn't see it. She knew this conversation wouldn't shift the world. His redemption, if it came, wouldn't dismantle the systems that allowed men like him to flourish. "I hope you do," Maya replied simply. "But understand, feeling bad about it isn't enough. Change comes from what you do next." "I get that." There was an awkward pause before Callahan murmured his agreement and ended the call. Maya slipped her phone into her pocket and stood in the quiet of the parking lot. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, it was acknowledgement. His acknowledgement of his wrongs. Her acknowledgement that the fight wasn't over. As she drove home, the hum of the city filled the space around her. Neon lights blurred along the windshield, casting faint shadows that danced across her face. Maya's thoughts drifted, not to Callahan, but to the countless others who had lived through the same experience. Only, they hadn't been FBI agents. They hadn't had Reed by their side or a captain willing to step in. They hadn't been as lucky. Maya gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her badge, her position had shielded her. But what about those without a badge, without influence? What about the voices drowned out by a system built to silence them? She thought about the younger version of herself, fresh out of Quantico, fueled by optimism and the belief that one person could spark change. That belief had taken a few hits over the years, but it wasn't gone. It lingered, quiet but persistent. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the glow of the streetlights pulsing like distant beacons. The system wouldn't change overnight. The battle for justice was far from over, but Maya wasn't backing down. She couldn't, because if she didn't keep fighting, who would? By the time she reached home, the weight of exhaustion fully settled over her. Maya pulled into her driveway, letting the engine idle as she rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The silence of the night pressed around her, heavy but strangely grounding. She stayed like that for a while, breathing in the quiet. The night was over, but the mission continued. Tomorrow Morales would still be out there. The operation wasn't finished, but tonight was a reminder. Not of defeat, but of resilience. Maya Daniels was resilient. She had to be. As the screen fades to black, a voice softly reminds viewers, "Thank you for watching." If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, change begins with the conversations we're willing to have.